It was one of those afternoons where the weather was absolutely perfect, with a soft blue sky and a gentle breeze that made you want to stay outside forever. For most people in the city, it was just another Tuesday, but for Sandra Bullock, it was a rare slice of freedom. She wasn't on a movie set, she wasn't walking a red carpet, and she wasn't giving an interview. She was just a woman trying to enjoy a quiet afternoon to herself. She pulled the brim of her baseball cap down lower over her eyes. It was a simple, worn-out cap, nothing flashy, paired with a cozy, oversized hoodie and a pair of loose-fitting jeans. On her feet, she wore comfortable sneakers that had seen better days. There wasn't a single drop of heavy makeup on her face, and her hair was tucked away messily under the hat. To anyone passing by, she looked like just another tourist or a local running errands. And that is exactly what she wanted. Sandra had spent decades under the bright lights of Hollywood, where every move she makes is watched and criticized. Today, she just wanted to disappear into the crowd. She wanted to feel the joy of walking down the street without security guards rushing her away. She carried a simple tote bag over her shoulder, whistling softly to herself as she navigated the busy sidewalks. Eventually, she found herself in the most expensive part of the city. This was the neighborhood where the sidewalks were spotlessly clean, and the air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and roasted coffee beans. The buildings here were tall and grand, made of glass and stone, housing the biggest fashion brands in the world. Sandra usually avoided this area unless she was attending an official event, but today, something drew her in. She stopped in front of a massive boutique. The windows were huge, stretching from the floor to the ceiling, and inside, everything was displayed like precious art in a museum. Handbags sat on velvet pedestals under spotlighting, and mannequins wore outfits that cost more than most people's cars. It was the kind of store where the doors are heavy and the prices are hidden, purely because if you have to ask, you probably can't afford it. Sandra stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the display. A little voice in her head told her to keep walking, to go get a coffee or visit a park instead. But another part of her was curious. She had worked hard her entire life. She had earned millions of dollars and accolades, yet she rarely took the time to just buy something nice for herself without a stylist telling her what to pick. Why not, she thought to herself. I'm just browsing. Nobody knows it's me. Taking a deep breath, she wrapped her fingers around the cold metal handle of the heavy glass door and pulled it open. A soft chime rang out above her, announcing her arrival. As she stepped across the threshold, the noise of the busy city streets faded away, replaced by a sudden, intense silence. The air inside was cool and crisp, pumped full of air conditioning that smelled faintly of leather and lavender. The floors were made of white marble, so shiny that Sandra could see her own reflection in them as she walked. It felt less like a shop and more like a palace, and for a moment, she felt a small spark of excitement. She walked further in, her sneakers making a soft squeak against the floor that seemed to echo in the quiet room. She wandered toward a rack of silk scarves near the entrance. They were beautiful, with vibrant colors and intricate patterns. She reached out to touch one, feeling the soft fabric between her fingers. It felt nice to just look at clothes without any pressure. She smiled to herself, feeling like she had successfully pulled off her disguise. She was just another customer, anonymous and free. However, that feeling of freedom didn't last long. From the back of the store, near the cash registers which looked more like a bank vault, two women in sharp black suits were watching her. They were the sales associates, and they had been chatting happily amongst themselves until Sandra walked in. The moment the door chimed, their heads snapped up. They didn't see a movie star. They didn't see a successful, wealthy woman. They saw the hoodie. They saw the messy hair. They saw the sneakers. The taller of the two women leaned in and whispered something to her colleague, and they both let out a quiet, snide laugh. It was a laugh that carried across the quiet room, landing like a stone in Sandra's stomach. They didn't even try to hide their judgment. Their eyes scanned Sandra up and down, clearly deciding that she wasn't good enough to be in their store. They didn't offer a greeting. They didn't say welcome. They just stared with cold, calculating looks that screamed, "You don't belong here." Sandra noticed the change in the atmosphere immediately. The friendly smile she had been wearing slowly faded. She could feel their eyes burning into her back as she moved from the scarves to a display of jewelry. It was a terrible feeling, a hot flush of embarrassment that started at her neck and rose to her cheeks, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. She had millions of dollars in the bank, yet at this moment, these two strangers made her feel like she was a child who had wandered into a place she wasn't supposed to be. She tried to shake it off. She told herself to ignore them, to just look at what she came to see and leave. But the energy in the room was so heavy and rude that it was hard to think clearly. Every time she touched a piece of clothing, she felt like she was doing something forbidden. The silence of the shop was no longer peaceful, it was hostile. She stood there alone in the middle of the luxury store, feeling small and humiliated, wondering if she should just turn around and walk back out the door. Sandra tried to ignore the heavy feeling in her chest and forced herself to keep moving. She walked deeper into the store, telling herself that she was overreacting. She told herself that maybe these women were just having a bad day, or maybe they were simply very serious about their jobs. She didn't want to believe that people could actually be this mean to a stranger for no reason. She focused her attention on the beautiful items around her, trying to get back into the joy of shopping. She found herself standing in front of a glass display case that held a collection of stunning handbags. One bag in particular caught her eye. It was a classic design, made of the softest-looking leather she had ever seen, in a shade of deep, rich red that reminded her of a sunset. It wasn't flashy or covered in logos, which was exactly why she liked it. It was elegant. She stood there for a moment, just admiring the way the light hit the leather, imagining how nice it would be to own something so simple and well-made. She decided she wanted to feel it. She wanted to see if the leather was as soft as it looked. Sandra knew she could afford it without blinking an eye, but she also knew that buying something shouldn't just be about spending money. It was about the connection to the item. She took a deep breath, preparing to ask the saleswomen if she could see the bag, even though their body language made it clear they didn't want to talk to her. Before she could even open her mouth, the two women in black suits moved. They didn't walk over to her with a smile to ask if she needed assistance. Instead, they seemed to glide over like guard dogs protecting a fortress, positioning themselves between Sandra and the rest of the store. The taller one stood right next to her, her arms crossed over her chest, staring down at Sandra's sneakers with a look of undisguised distaste. "Can I help you with something?" the woman asked. Her voice wasn't friendly or welcoming. It was sharp and cold, the kind of voice you use when you are telling someone to get off your property. The tone implied one thing clearly: you are wasting my time. Sandra cleared her throat, feeling a little nervous now. "Hi," she said softly, keeping her cap low. "I was just wondering if I could take a look at the red bag in the window, the one on the top shelf." The woman looked at Sandra, then looked at the bag, and then let out a small, dismissive sigh. She turned to her colleague and rolled her eyes before looking back at Sandra. "That is a very exclusive piece," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It is a collector's item. It is extremely fragile and quite expensive." "I understand," Sandra replied, trying to stay polite. "I would just like to hold it for a moment." The woman hesitated. She didn't believe Sandra. She looked at Sandra's worn-out jeans and her simple hoodie, and she made a snap judgment. In her mind, there was no way this woman could afford a bag like that. She probably just wanted to touch it to feel what luxury felt like, or perhaps she was just bored. "Fine," the woman said with a shrug. She opened the case slowly, making a show of how difficult it was, and pulled out the bag. Instead of handing it to Sandra, she held it up in the air, out of reach, like she was displaying a trophy. "Please do not touch the hardware," she snapped. "The oils on your hands can tarnish the metal." Sandra felt her face burn with embarrassment. She wasn't a child. She knew how to handle a handbag. But she bit her tongue and nodded. "Okay, I understand." Finally, the woman placed the bag on the glass counter. Sandra reached out with one hand, gently touching the soft leather. It was just as beautiful as she thought it would be. For a split second, she forgot about the rude women and just enjoyed the texture of the bag. She ran her thumb gently over the stitching, admiring the craftsmanship. Suddenly, the woman snatched the bag away. It was such a sudden and aggressive move that Sandra flinched and pulled her hand back. "You are holding it too tightly," the woman scolded, her voice rising slightly. Sandra kept her head down as she walked across the cold marble floor, her sneakers making soft sounds that seemed to mock her in the silence. She just wanted to get out. The air inside the shop felt heavy now, thick with the judgment of the women who worked there. She could still hear them laughing behind her, fawning over the woman in the fur coat, treating her like a queen while they had treated Sandra like a nuisance. It was a sharp, stinging feeling, the kind that sits in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. She felt small, and for someone who spent her life entertaining millions of people, feeling invisible in the wrong way was a terrible experience. She reached out her hand, her fingers wrapping around the heavy brass handle of the glass door. She took one last breath of that expensive, lavender-scented air, ready to push it open and step back into the real world where people didn't care what shoes you were wearing. She was just inches away from freedom, just seconds away from leaving this humiliation behind her. But just as she began to pull the door open, the weight on the other side pushed back. The heavy glass door swung inward with force, nearly hitting her. Sandra jumped back, startled, and let go of the handle. She looked up, annoyed and ready to step aside, expecting to see another snooty customer rushing in. Instead, a tall man walked through the door. He was wearing a heavy, dark jacket that looked a little worn around the edges, zipped all the way up. Underneath the jacket, you could just see the collar of a simple t-shirt. He had a scruffy beard, a bit of stubble that looked like he hadn't shaved in a few days, and his hair was messy and windblown. He looked like he had been walking for miles, or perhaps riding a motorcycle through the city. He wasn't wearing any flashy jewelry, and his boots looked like they had seen plenty of streets. In the world of high-fashion luxury, this man looked just as out of place as Sandra did. Behind the counter, the two saleswomen stopped their fake laughter with the lady in the fur coat. They turned their heads toward the door, ready to pounce. To them, this was another intruder. Another person who was going to come in, touch the expensive fabrics with dirty hands, and waste their precious time. The tall woman with the cold eyes stepped forward, her jaw set tight, preparing to use her sharp voice to chase this new man away before he could even look at a price tag. But the man didn't even look at them. He walked in with a relaxed, easy stride, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He seemed completely unaware of the tension in the room, or the way the staff was glaring at him. He stood just inside the entrance for a moment, scanning the shop. He wasn't looking at the handbags or the jewelry. He was looking at the people. His eyes swept past the angry saleswoman, past the lady in the fur coat, and landed directly on the figure standing by the door. Sandra was trying to shrink into the background, hoping he wouldn't notice her so she could slip out past him. But then the man's face changed. His eyes, which had been focused and serious, suddenly widened. A look of pure, genuine delight spread across his face. It was the kind of smile that starts in the eyes and crinkles the corners of the mouth before you even show your teeth. It was a smile of recognition and warmth. He ignored the saleswoman who was marching toward him to tell him to leave. Instead, he stepped right into her path, dodging her effortlessly, and made a beeline for Sandra. "Sandy," he said. His voice was deep and gentle, cutting through the cold air of the store like a knife. Sandra froze. She knew that voice. She looked up, pulling the bill of her baseball cap up slightly so she could see his face better. Standing there, looking rough around the edges but with the kindest eyes in the world, was Keanu Reeves. He wasn't John Wick right now, and he wasn't dressed for a premiere. He was just Keanu. He looked real and human, and he was looking at his friend like she was the only person in the room. "Oh my gosh, Keanu," Sandra said, her voice cracking a little in surprise. All the shame and embarrassment she had been feeling just seconds ago evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a rush of relief and genuine happiness. The saleswoman stopped dead in her tracks. She stood there with her mouth slightly open, looking back and forth between the scruffy man in the old jacket and the woman she had just treated like trash. She didn't recognize him immediately. He didn't look like the movie stars she saw in magazines, but the sudden shift in energy was undeniable. This man wasn't a random customer. He was someone important. But Keanu didn't care about the confusion he was causing. He walked right up to Sandra and wrapped her in a big, warm hug. It wasn't a polite, Hollywood air kiss. It was a real bear hug, the kind you give a friend you haven't seen in a long time. He squeezed her tight, and for a moment, Sandra leaned into him, grateful for the anchor in the middle of the storm she had just endured. "I didn't expect to see you here," Keanu said, pulling back but keeping his hands on her shoulders. He looked at her face, smiling that easy smile. "Are you shopping or are you hiding out from the world too?" Sandra laughed, a real laugh this time, the tension melting out of her shoulders. "A little bit of both, I think," she replied. "I was just leaving, actually. I think I came to the wrong place." Keanu looked around the store, his expression turning a bit more serious as he took in the pristine, cold atmosphere and the staff members who were now watching them with terrified, confused looks. He noticed the way the women were looking at Sandra's clothes and then back at his own jacket. He noticed the tension that still hung in the air like a bad smell. He turned back to Sandra, his face softening. He didn't ask her what happened. He didn't need to. He could read people better than most. He knew his friend. He knew she was kind and humble, and he knew that places like this often treated humble people terribly. He could see the lingering flush of embarrassment on her cheeks, and he understood exactly what had gone down in the few minutes before he walked in. "Well, I'm glad I caught you before you escaped," Keanu said, his tone light and playful, trying to cheer her up. "I was actually looking for a gift for someone, but I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. I was dreading walking in here alone. It's much better now that you're here." He glanced over his shoulder at the sales staff. The tall woman who had been so rude to Sandra was now trying to inch closer, her face pale. She was realizing who he was. She saw the posters of the movies, she connected the face to the name, and the realization hit her like a bucket of ice water. She had just kicked out a movie superstar and insulted her best friend. Keanu looked back at Sandra, ignoring the woman completely. He gave her a playful nudge with his elbow. "So, tell me, Sandy, were you about to buy something amazing, or were you just messing with them?" He grinned, letting her know that they were in this together now, a team against the pretentious world of the shop. Sandra looked at him, feeling the weight lift off her chest. The day had started with loneliness and ended with humiliation, but now, standing there with her friend, she felt strong again. "I was just looking at a red bag," she admitted softly. "But I don't think they liked my hands very much." Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of protectiveness crossing his face, but he kept his smile steady. He turned his body slightly, positioning himself between Sandra and the rest of the shop, like a shield. He was ready to handle the situation, and Sandra knew that things were about to change. The tables were about to turn, and the rude staff had no idea what was coming for them. Keanu stood there for a moment, letting Sandra's words sink in. He looked at her hands, strong, capable hands that had held awards, signed autographs for thousands of fans, and helped countless people, and then he looked over at the saleswoman who had been so incredibly rude. The atmosphere in the shop shifted instantly. What had been a place of cold, snobby indifference suddenly turned into a room thick with tension and regret. The tall saleswoman who had wiped the bag with such aggression was now standing just a few feet away. Her face was changing color. First, it was a look of annoyance that this scruffy man was interrupting her day. But then, as she really looked at him, her eyes widened in recognition. She saw the distinctive shape of his nose, the specific way he stood, the kindness in his eyes that she had seen on movie posters for decades. Her jaw dropped slightly. The man standing in front of her in the old jacket wasn't just a random customer. It was Keanu Reeves, one of the biggest movie stars in the world. She looked back at Sandra, then at Keanu, and then back at Sandra. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in her brain. The woman she had treated like a thief, the woman she had humiliated and mocked, wasn't just a random person in a hoodie. It was Sandra Bullock. Her famous co-star. Her friend. The realization hit the saleswoman like a bucket of ice water. She had just insulted one of the most powerful and beloved actresses in Hollywood, right in front of another Hollywood legend. The color drained from the saleswoman's face. She looked as if she might faint. The other saleswoman, who had been fawning over the lady in the fur coat, also froze. She recognized him too. The shop went dead silent. The expensive air conditioning seemed to hum louder than usual. The customer in the fur coat stopped looking at jewelry and stared, realizing she was in the middle of a very dramatic scene. The saleswoman's attitude flipped in a heartbeat. The sneer vanished, replaced by a terrified, trembling smile. She smoothed down her suit and took a step forward, her hands shaking slightly. She tried to act as if nothing had happened, but her voice betrayed her panic. "Mr. Reeves? Oh my goodness, I didn't realize it was you." She stammered, her voice high and shaky. "It is such an honor to have you in our store. And Ms. Bullock. I am so sorry, I didn't recognize you. We are just very strict about handling the merchandise, you understand, it is nothing personal." She was lying, of course. It had been completely personal. She had been rude because of how Sandra looked. but now that the cameras were potentially rolling in her mind, she wanted to play nice. Sandra looked at the woman, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The silence was louder than any shout could have been. Keanu, however, did not accept the fake apology. He didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't start screaming insults. That wasn't his style. Instead, he just looked at the woman with a calm, steady gaze that made her feel about 2 inches tall. It was the kind of look that makes you realize exactly what you did wrong without a single word being spoken. He took a small step forward, placing himself firmly between Sandra and the counter. It was a protective move, subtle but clear. He was drawing a line in the sand. Strict about the merchandise? Keanu asked softly. He gestured toward Sandra, a look of gentle confusion on his face. My friend has bought thousands of dollars of jewelry and bags in her lifetime. I'm pretty sure she knows how to hold a purse. The saleswoman swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room looking for an escape. I know, sir. It was just a misunderstanding. We would love to help you both. Perhaps we can show you some new arrivals. Keanu shook his head slowly. He looked around the pristine, empty shop with its cold floors and judgmental staff. He thought about how excited Sandra had been when she walked in, and how crushed she looked when she was trying to leave. He knew that no bag, no matter how beautiful or expensive, was worth this kind of treatment. You know, Keanu said, his voice calm but carrying clearly across the room, I came in here today because I wanted to buy something nice for someone. I have the money to spend, and I was ready to buy. He paused for a moment, looking the saleswoman right in the eyes. But I don't want to buy anything from people who treat my friends like they don't exist. And I certainly don't want to give my money to people who judge others by the clothes they wear. The words landed hard. The saleswoman opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. There was nothing she could say. He was right, and they all knew it. The customer in the fur coat put her hand over her mouth, looking shocked and embarrassed for the staff. The other shoppers who had wandered in stopped to watch, sensing the justice in the air. Keanu turned his back on the counter. He didn't want to look at them anymore. He didn't care about their expensive bags or their velvet ropes. To him, kindness was more important than luxury. He turned back to Sandra, and his face softened completely. The serious protector vanished, replaced again by the warm, friendly guy she had known for years. He smiled at her, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Come on, he said softly to her, nodding his head toward the door. Let's get out of here. This place is too stuffy anyway. It smells like attitude, not leather. Sandra felt a rush of gratitude wash over her. She looked at him and smiled back, the humiliation completely gone now. She wasn't a victim anymore, she was standing next to a friend who had her back. I think you're right, she said, her voice strong again. I suddenly lost the urge to buy that red bag. Good, Keanu said, offering her his arm. Because I know a place down the street that makes the best sandwiches. And they don't care what you wear. In fact, I think the guy there wears an apron that is dirtier than my sneakers. Sandra laughed, a sound that rang out happily in the quiet shop. She took his arm, linking her elbow through his. They looked like a perfect team, two superstars who didn't need the validation of a fancy store to know their worth. Together, they turned and walked toward the glass doors. They moved at a leisurely pace, ignoring the stunned staff watching them. They didn't run away. They didn't sneak out. They walked out with their heads held high, leaving the silence and the shame behind them for the salespeople to deal with. As they reached the door, Keanu reached out and pushed it open, holding it for Sandra, letting the warm sunlight of the real world flood back in and chase away the cold shadows of the boutique. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind them, effectively sealing away the cold, judgmental world of the boutique. As soon as they stepped out onto the sidewalk, the noise of the city rushed back to greet them, the honking of taxis, the chatter of pedestrians, and the distant wail of a siren. To anyone else, these sounds might have been annoying, but to Sandra, it was the most beautiful symphony she had heard all day. It was the sound of reality. It was the sound of people going about their lives without caring about brand names or price tags. Sandra took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh, outside air. She felt her shoulders drop, inches that she didn't even know she was holding up relaxing instantly. The tight knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen. Just moments ago, she had felt small and humiliated, like a child being scolded. But now, walking next to Keanu, she felt her confidence returning. She didn't need the validation of a rude saleswoman to know her worth. She was Sandra Bullock. She was a survivor, a mother, and a successful artist, and no one could take that away from her. Keanu didn't say anything immediately. He just walked beside her, his hands still in his jacket pockets, matching her pace. He knew she needed a minute to decompress. He was good at that, reading the silence, understanding what people needed without them having to ask. He didn't push her to talk about the incident, and he didn't make a big joke out of it right away. He was just there, a solid, steady presence that grounded her. After a block or two, Sandra looked over at him and let out a small, shaky laugh. "You know," she said, shaking her head, "I actually really liked that red bag. I think I might have bought it if they had just been, human." Keanu smiled, looking down at the sidewalk as they walked. "It was a nice bag," he agreed. "But imagine carrying it around. Every time you looked at it, you wouldn't see the leather or the color, you'd just remember that lady with the white cloth and the sour face. Who wants to carry that kind of energy around with them?" "You're right," Sandra nodded. It would have been $1,000 reminder of a bad afternoon. They turned a corner, leaving the high-end fashion district behind and moving into a slightly grittier, more vibrant part of the city. The buildings here were shorter, the sidewalks a bit more crowded, and the smell of the air changed. The scent of expensive perfume was replaced by the mouth-watering aroma of roasted peanuts, hot oil, and grilled onions. Keanu stopped suddenly, pointing toward a small, silver food truck parked on the corner. An older man with a weathered face and a friendly gray mustache was standing behind the counter, flipping burgers and handing out foil-wrapped packages to a line of construction workers and office messengers. "There," Keanu said, his eyes lighting up. "That is the spot. Best chili dogs in the city." Sandra looked at the truck, then back at the fancy street they had just left. The contrast was hilarious. You want to go from a boutique where handbags cost as much as houses to a food truck. "Absolutely," Keanu said, leading the way. "The staff here doesn't care what you're wearing. The guy in the apron there, he treats everyone like a star. Plus, he puts extra onions on if you ask nicely." They walked up to the window. The vendor looked up, wiping his hands on a towel. He didn't recognize them immediately, or maybe he did and just didn't care. He just looked at two hungry people and gave them a warm, gap-toothed smile. "Hey there. What can I get for you folks today?" "2 chili dogs, everything on them," Keanu said. "And 2 waters, please." "Coming right up," the vendor chirped, turning to the grill. Sandra leaned against the side of the truck, watching the bustle of the street. A young mother walked by pushing a stroller, talking on the phone. A bike messenger zoomed past, swerving through traffic. This was the real world. It was messy and loud, but it was authentic. She realized that this was where she felt comfortable. She didn't belong in a glass box where people were afraid to breathe on the merchandise. She belonged right here, on the street, eating greasy food with her friend. They got their food and found a small, empty bench a few yards away. They sat down, side by side, unwrapping the foil from their hot dogs. It wasn't a Michelin star restaurant. There were no white tablecloths, no waiters pouring wine, and no judgment. Just a bench, a paper wrapper, and a dog covered in chili. Sandra took a big bite. It was messy, spicy, and absolutely delicious. She laughed as a bit of chili sauce threatened to drip onto her hoodie. She wiped it away with a napkin, not caring a bit. "This is so much better than a handbag," she said with her mouth full. Keanu nodded, taking a bite of his own. "This tastes like freedom," he said. He looked over at her, his expression turning a bit more serious but still gentle. "I'm sorry about back there, Sandy. People can be lost sometimes. They get so caught up in things that they forget how to be people." Sandra looked at him, touched by his sincerity. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly. "You walked in and you saved the day. You literally stepped forward and fixed everything. I was ready to run away and hide, and then you were there." Keanu shrugged, looking down at his feet. "I just didn't want my friend to feel alone. Nobody should be treated like that, whether they are famous or not. It's just basic respect." They sat there for a long time, eating their lunch and watching the world go by. They talked about everything and nothing: movies they wanted to make, places they wanted to visit, and how good the onions on the dog were. For that hour, they weren't megastars. They were just two friends enjoying a sunny afternoon. Eventually, they finished their food and crumpled up the foil wrappers. Sandra stood up, tossing the trash into a nearby bin. She stretched her arms over her head, feeling the last of the negative energy from the store leave her body. "Ready?" Keanu asked, standing up and brushing a few crumbs off his jacket. "Ready," Sandra smiled. They started walking again, drifting aimlessly through the city. The incident at the luxury store felt like a distant memory now, a story they would laugh about at dinner parties in the future. The humiliation was gone, replaced by a warm sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the friend who stood by her, gratitude for the city that welcomed her, and gratitude for the simple things in life like a chili dog on a bench that money couldn't buy. As they walked, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the sidewalk. They didn't know where they were going next, and it didn't matter. They had each other's backs, and in a world that was often obsessed with appearances, that was the most expensive luxury of all.